There's a certain kind of thinking that happens when you're sitting at a red light. It's the same kind of thinking you have in the morning shower or when you're trying to fall asleep at night. Something about the idling or steady stream of white noise creates this weird mental vacuum. You exist in a little bubble of suspended responsibility. You're not fully engaged with anything, so your mind wanders. If you're not replaying every single embarrassing moment you've had since the 5th grade, you start asking questions like, what is a mirror made out of? Do I actually understand how electricity works? Do the men that have man buns call them man buns or just buns? Maybe your mind drifts to half-baked ideas and hypotheticals. Should I open a food truck? I could definitely climb Mount Everest. What would life be like if bugs were just 20% larger? It's a horrible thing to think about. And sometimes, depending on the type of person you are and the mood you're in, or how long you've been sitting at the red light, you wander to the darker parts of your brain. A place that's a little more ethically questionable. The I bet I could get away with it place. Then the light turns green. You drive away and life continues and you completely forget about everything you just asked yourself. Unless, of course, you're Frank Bourassa. Not sure if he got caught in a series of red lights that let him think for way too long, but Frank asked himself one of those ethically questionable questions. As he put it, there was a moment where I was stopped at a red light and I was like, why do we go to work? Why do we set up businesses? The end goal is to make money. And when the light turned green, he didn't let it go. Quote again, it was at that moment that I decided to start printing fake money. For most people, the idea of counterfeiting lasts about half a second before you realize you can barely even figure out your printer's toner cartridge at home. So the chance of outsmarting the governments and treasuries with their watermark, security measures, and agencies dedicated to preventing this exact scenario are very low. Even for money, it's not worth it. But Frank came at it from a different angle. He didn't just print fake money. Despite being a high school dropout, he had an intuitive business savvy about him, and he would use it to single-handedly create a full-scale enterprise that investigators would later describe as one of the largest currency counterfeiting operations in North American history. Money was just the product. To be more specific, $250 million worth of $20 bills so unbelievably exact that trained professionals couldn't tell the difference. Even more impressive, he ran his entire operation from a little rented garage on a rural Quebec farm that may or may not still be there today. Frank was eventually caught, but he would reveal an epic bargaining chip to the prosecutors at just the right time to negotiate the sweetest of sweetheart deals, and he essentially bought himself a get-out-of-jail-free card using fake money. It was some insane real-life Monopoly level stuff. However, to this day, authorities have never found the location of his operation, and if it still exists, Frank hasn't been back to it since his arrest. So a professional treasury-grade printing press, along with the currency plates and all materials, could still be out there somewhere. You know, if anyone wants to create American Tinder that looks completely real to the naked eye. Also, my legal team would like me to clarify that this is not a suggestion, nor is it a challenge, and you should not do that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. But Frank managed to take this all the way. Not only did he print more fake money than he could ever spend, but he managed to print the very money that he used to buy his way out of jail. So hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about the rise and fall of the king of counterfeiting, Mr. Frank Bourassa, a Canadian high school dropout who, from 2008 to 2012, printed and sold hundreds of millions of fake American dollars, netting him about 80 million real dollars. Because as any good drug dealer or the McDonald's CEO knows, don't use your own product. Rather than using his innate God-given business acumen for good, Frank parlayed his skills into becoming a low-level criminal middleman and ascending to the man who is now in the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's greatest counterfeiter, which I think it's really weird that Guinness has a reward for that. I mean, like, what if someone was a serial killer? Does that get a reward? And would I do a video on that guy? Almost definitely. And as impressive as it is that Frank made the record books, maybe even more shocking is that he only got 6 weeks of jail time and is now working with the very government he swindled in the very same industry he did that swindling in, as an anti-counterfeit consultant. It's a reality that sounds almost too strange to be real, and it's the one we're going to talk about today. So if all that sounds interesting to you, then stick around as we talk about the story of the king of counterfeiting. Debt is no laughing matter, especially when it starts to affect the things you can do with your life. Balances aren't shrinking and fees are stacking up. It can be scary. Thankfully, today's sponsor, PDS Debt, is here to help. PDS Debt has already helped hundreds of thousands of people reduce what they owe and take back control. Whether you're struggling with credit cards, personal loans, or medical bills, PDS Debt has custom options to help you get out of debt. They go beyond the numbers to understand your unique financial situation and craft a personalized plan designed just for you. And there's no minimum credit score required. They're here to help you save more, pay off your debt faster, and start putting back money where it belongs. That's your pocket. PDS Debt is A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau, boasts thousands of 5-star reviews on Google, and holds a 5-star rating on Trustpilot. That's because PDS Debt has helped hundreds of thousands of people get out of their debt. Every month you wait costs you more in interest and fees. The best time to start was yesterday. The second best is right now. Debt is no laughing matter, and the joke's over now. Change your story in 30 seconds and get your free, personalized assessment and the best option for you at pdsdebt.com/Wendigang. That's right, you can get a free, personalized assessment and then go from there. That's pds.com/Wendigang or pdsdebt.com/Wendigang to get it on their offer today. Thank you to PDS Debt for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description, and we are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. If this whole story sounds familiar, you've probably seen the movie Catch Me If You Can. It's the story of a man coincidentally also named Frank Abagnale, portrayed by a young Leonardo DiCaprio. Abagnale profited in a big way by printing his own money in the form of checks. Though he became proficient at recreating blank checks, Abagnale's fraud relied less on technical engineering and more on social engineering, using his charm and wit to convince people he was someone else, famously impersonating commercial pilots, doctors, and lawyers. Well, Frank Bourassa likely wouldn't be played by someone as handsome as Leo. Think more like a Guy Fieri, but without the hair, which is, like 80% of Guy Fieri. And he liked to keep to himself, hence the garage in the middle of nowhere. But what did the two highly successful counterfeiters have in common? Well, they began a life of crime at an early age, long before their printing presses ever started running. Frank Bourassa was born in 1970 and raised in the city of Trois-Rivières in Quebec, Canada, the province where his alleged hidden printing press still hides in. Like another famous dropout turned garage entrepreneur, Frank was known to think different. In this case, that means he couldn't think within the boundaries of a legal framework, even at a young age. Frank's entry into the life of crime started as early as 7th grade. He didn't dabble in petty theft and stealing candy bars from Walmart or Circle K like most common 12-year-old criminals. Before he even hit puberty, Frank was displaying a kind of business sense most adults never learn. For better or worse, getting through middle school and high school emotionally unscathed depends on one's social status. And the easiest way to raise social status? Having expensive things. Frank knew exactly how to leverage this. The school he went to had about 2,000 students. To him, this wasn't just a big school. What he saw was a decent-sized market of potential customers. It was an opportunity to sell status by moving stolen, high-end goods to students at a profit, but still under market value, also known as the sweet spot. Frank mastered this. He wouldn't steal things himself because he was smarter than that. He knew the physical act of theft yields a higher chance of getting caught. Instead, he would source these high-end goods that someone else stole, then flip them to affluent or desperate students. Commendable enterprising for a middle school kid. Unfortunately, it was criminal enterprising, but still. Young Frank worked this angle for several years, and why not? Quote, I started making good money, hundreds a week, which for a 14, 15-year-old kid, that's huge. I should mention that this quote comes from an interview he would later give to GQ. Not many counterfeiters getting interviewed by GQ, I guess. But Frank couldn't get away with it forever. Depending on who you ask, he was expelled or quit school, and his first racket came to a halt. He moved out of his parents' home at the age of 15. Obviously not an ideal upbringing, but it's incredible that he was able to find a place to live, buy groceries, and be financially independent as a literal teenager. Not all of his financial independence came from wheeling and dealing in expensive stolen goods, though. Frank got a job as a mechanic that helped him pay rent, and it was a legitimate employment, kind of. Maybe it was a cover, maybe it was a means of outsourcing, maybe both, but eventually, this position gave him the skills, or at the very least the inspiration, to escalate his criminal operation by trafficking stolen cars. Again, Frank would maintain a buffer between himself and the hard criminal acts themselves. He didn't steal the cars. Rather than being the direct perpetrator, he was the facilitator, or the middleman. In a quote where he would admit with a not-so-subtle pride, I had 2 or 3 guys who I'd give the orders to, and then they'd go jump the cars. This gave him an extremely valuable layer of insulation. It doesn't appear that he was ever close to being caught, but a few years and nearly 500 cars later, he made what he called, quote, the most regrettable error of his professional life. That error was, he went legit. With the knowledge he had acquired from years spent in the shop, mixed with the logistical skill set he acquired from his early entrepreneur days, Frank, now in his late 20s, established a mildly successful small business that produced brake pads. And as mentioned, this business was completely above the board. For a small business, even mild success is considered exceptional. And for Frank, that was tough. This legitimate venture required discipline, long-term planning, and 20-hour days just to turn somewhat of a profit. For a guy who was making a lot more money flipping stolen cars, you could imagine the headspace he was in. And also, 500 cars, my gosh, just... I would have just kept doing that. Frank succeeded by a lot of people's standards, but he couldn't stand the whole, as he described it, working plebeian lifestyle for such relatively meager returns. It nearly drove him crazy, to the point that he wound up suffering a severe nervous breakdown. In 2004, medical exams showed that he had vitamin deficiencies, uncontrollable tremors, and was on the verge of physical collapse. He was diagnosed with acute stress disorder and prescribed anti-anxiety medication. This job was clearly not sustainable. Life as an honest man could not and would not work for him. So he did the only thing that made any sense. He sold the business and vowed never to make an honest dollar again. But he would make $1. Frank's first venture back into the underground workforce was in one of the fastest growing Canadian trades at the time, marijuana. He became a grower and a smuggler in 2006 and made good money doing it. Even with all the secrecy and the threats of law enforcement and jail time, he found it a lot less physically and emotionally rigorous than running his above-the-board business. Which it is funny to imagine a guy having a mental breakdown selling brake pads, and then he gets into drug trafficking and he's like, oh, thank God. I can relax now. But later that year, the authorities raided one of his suppliers. This led to Frank getting caught and convicted on a drug-related charge. He was sentenced to 12 months, but only had to serve 3, and he served it from the comfort of his living room. Thank you, Canada. When Frank was allowed to leave the confines of his home, he wouldn't return to the marijuana trade. Cheaper Mexican weed entered the picture, so making money in Canadian weed became harder, and a return to the tax-paying workforce was out of the question. Frank had to figure out his next move. He hit a red light metaphorically, and then literally. While at a red light one day, his mind wandered, and eventually, he reached the conclusion that he didn't want to earn money. He wanted to make money, which would be a great tagline to Frank's biopic starring a bald Guy Fieri. And so, that's exactly what he did. Rather than treating his foray into counterfeiting like his previous criminal enterprises, he treated it more like his brake pad business. He wouldn't be the middleman, and instead served as the one physically producing the illegal goods. It was high risk being the producer, with the highest potential for reward he had ever known. In a quote from Frank, "I figured it was going to be very hard, but it was never daunting. I've been engineered from birth to find solutions for anything." This sounds like a quote from basically every Fortune 500 executive with a profile in Forbes, which is fitting, as Frank was never a two-bit criminal. He was much more of a businessman who just so happened to have a penchant for illegitimate products. When he put his mind to something, he went all in. And this would be no different. Frank wasn't starting completely from scratch. He had a decent-sized rainy day fund stashed away from his pot smuggling days. This afforded him time to really dive in. For nearly 2 years, starting in 2008, he completely dedicated his life to perfecting the craft of counterfeiting. He visited counterfeiting chat rooms and forums, discovered what kind of machinery and materials to use, who to sell it to, and for how much. His biggest resource, though, was, ironically, straight from the government itself. Most official Treasury websites offer detailed descriptions of the security features for each bill and note. The United States version actually had in-depth and illustrated guides showing off the security measures they take with serial numbers, watermarks, and plate numbers. While likely intended as a deterrent, it was inevitable that at least one person would use this to their advantage, to thwart the very system that it was meant to protect. And it just so happened for our story that one person was Frank. After researching the world's currencies, Frank decided that he was going to counterfeit the US dollar. According to him, there were two major factors behind this decision. It was the easiest to recreate, and it was the most widely accepted throughout the world. And the third factor was that he hated the United States. And to me, that's just a funny reason to factor into your counterfeiting operation. Like, yeah, I'd assume you hate any country a little bit if you're counterfeiting currency in it. Frank's research dictated that he should only produce $20 bills for a few reasons. At the time, the 20 actually had weaker security features than the $10 bill. It also has a high enough circulation rate to be constantly changing hands. And while the $100 note technically has the most bills in circulation, those aren't moving around nearly as much as your typical 20, so they're easier to track and trace. I mean, the $100 bill is in high circulation because there's so much of it being held by like banks and large businesses. The $1 bill is the second most highly circulated, so if he's not going to do $100 bills because they don't change hands as much and there's big security features, you would think he would counterfeit the $1 bill, but it's impractical for counterfeiting purposes because to make any substantial amount, you have to make a ton. Whereas the 20 is quite literally 20 times as effective. But perhaps the biggest reason why Frank chose to counterfeit 20s was the way it was handled. Bank tellers and cashiers are taught to scrutinize 50s and 100s, always holding them up to the light, checking if they're real with their felt-tipped counterfeiting pins. A $20 bill, on the other hand, is the highest denomination that will fly under the radar. Nobody bats an eye at a 20, it just passes right through. So for Frank, the $20 bill was the winner. So now that Frank had a plan, he had to execute it, which was not cheap. Your typical $49.99 Hewlett-Packard DeskJet home printer obviously would not do. Not even those massive machines at FedEx office were capable of printing a realistic dollar bill. Frank bought a professional high-grade rig called a Heidelberg. For the printing nerds out there, if there are printing nerds that watch this channel for some reason, it was a 4-color offset press and it cost him around $125,000. A second single-color Heidelberg was purchased for test runs, costing him another $24,000. But despite being $150,000 into this thing, it wasn't as simple as buying a couple printers and calling it a day. Frank also needed the accompanying equipment, like plates and plate making systems, industrial paper cutters, specialized presses for applying security measures like foil and embossing. He needed to buy separate smaller printers that used a gel-based ink to print the serial numbers. As you can imagine, he was pretty quickly burning through his rainy day marijuana fund. And then finally, he would need the raw materials. This would prove to be expensive, yes, but it was also the hardest and most time-consuming aspect of the whole process. As it turns out, counterfeiting is not necessarily a printing challenge as much as it is a material problem. High-quality professional printing presses are expensive, but they're somewhat easy to find since they're commonly used for printing newspapers, magazines, and comic books. Sourcing all the necessary materials to make real currency is much tougher, requiring diligence and some good old-fashioned nom de plume, or as the French say, a bunch of made-up identities. Obviously, there are many suppliers of papers, inks, holograms, and the like, but these suppliers are taught to look out for certain requests. Like when someone asks them to create the same paper blend with the same security measures as the American dollar, that's a big red flag. If you call up a paper distributor and ask for the exact blend of American $100 bills with the same level of tolerance, you're probably going to get a very interesting knock at your door. It's like when people make the not so fun drugs, like methamphetamine. The ones who get away with it source different things from different places, buy things in cash, and never hit the same store twice. Which is a lesson from the first episode of Breaking Bad, not from experience. Again, my attorneys have asked me to point that out. Frank employed a similar tactic. He had to buy his paper from one source, his watermark from another source, and so forth. And none of his sources could be based in the United States. The first move was to find a paper supplier. According to experts, and probably the chat rooms Frank visited, the tangible feel of a fake bill is always the first and the biggest giveaway. If it didn't feel right, it probably wasn't, so getting authentic paper was an absolute must. For those who don't know, the US dollar bill is printed and again, legal, you find this online, blah, 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 is printed on a proprietary substrate that is a blend of 75% cotton and 25% linen. It has red and blue security fibers embedded throughout, a security thread with micro-printed text, chemical compounds that won't be detected by those anti-counterfeiting pins, and a watermark molded into the paper during the manufacturing process. A regular person can't just call up a supplier and ask for all this. That would be a great way to go straight to jail. So in the fall of 2008, Frank posed as several different people, like the owner of a stationery store looking for specialty paper, and a rep for an investment firm looking to issue its own corporate bonds. Frank used fake names like Thomas Moore and Jackson Maxwell to inquire suppliers. But as he soon found out, even paper mills and suppliers outside the United States knew what was up when someone asked for a cotton line blend with light security features, and they would hang up the phone immediately. Frank spent a lot of time and made a lot of phone calls to perfect his pitch. It was a long and frustrating trial and error process. Eventually, he would figure out how to slow roll his ask, and in what order. Finally, after several months of this, Jackson Maxwell of the Keystone Investment and Trading Company got a bite, a Swiss paper company called Artats. Frank, or Jackson, would institute the boiling frog in the pot strategy, and over the course of a few more months, made small, incremental changes to the specifications he needed until he got where he wanted. And Artats was completely oblivious to the fact that these changes would add up to be the exact security measures of the American $20 bill. The final thing Frank needed was someone to produce the watermark for the giant face in the middle of the bill, and he found one in Germany called Durin. In a profile for GQ titled The Great Paper Caper, Frank told journalist Wells Tower that this part of the process was surprisingly easy. Using a $100 bill as an example, he pointed at Ben Franklin's face and said, "You're somebody way back in China. You wouldn't think twice about printing this asshole." Who is that? They don't know. He looks like a clown for all I care. I'd say, "Yeah, I'm from a circus. We're having this production. We'd like to do some flyers, so I need a die for this. Here's our clown. Bozo." So to the German manufacturing the watermark, they were just being paid to holographically create the likeness of what they thought was some random man with great hair. To Americans, this is former President Andrew Jackson. Durin went with it, and finally Frank had the perfect recipe for counterfeit money. Which it's insane that it took months of trickery to get the right blend of paper, but when it came to printing the president's face the way he needed for a watermark, a company's like, "Oh yeah, Bozo the Clown. Got it." Frank needed a highly specific paper blend which required extensive customization, which meant Artats required a large minimum order, enough paper to print 12.5 million fake bills. This cost Frank another 45 grand. All in all, Frank had invested $300,000 of his own real dollars to get his new business off the ground. Doing the math, 12.5 million $20 bills equals $250 million. So selling $250 million of counterfeit money was his target. Ask any other counterfeiter. That is an amount of money that only an insane person would attempt to sell. But Frank fit the bill. I just want you all to know, underneath that line in the script, Reynold wrote, "I'm killing it, huh?" referring to his fit the bill line. Being killed for it, maybe. Frank's plan was to try and sell his entire supply of counterfeit bills at 30 cents on the dollar, which would net him $80 million return. A pretty comfortable living to say the least. Doing it in one fell swoop meant he could get in and out, one and done, and then retire. But first, he had to make the product to sell. And not only that, but he had to do it carefully. When Frank got the call from the port of Montreal that his shipment of Artats paper had arrived from Switzerland, he didn't rush down to pick it up. Instead, he hired two friends to surveil the port's parking lot for 2 days in 2 separate cars, looking for customs agents, law enforcement, or anything out of the ordinary. This was a risky move in itself. The longer his shipment stayed at the port, the more of a chance a curious worker or even the authorities could have inspected its contents. Anyone with any knowledge of counterfeiting would take one look at the order and end the operation right there. I mean, it's a super rare order of the exact consistency of $20 bills with all the security measures. Someone would think something is up. Luckily for Frank, that didn't happen. When the coast was clear, Frank himself came down on the 3rd day and surveyed the scene for himself with a pair of binoculars. Satisfied, he called his runner to load the shipment onto a box truck and had it transported to a small farm near his hometown. He was renting out the farm's garage from a man who asked no questions, just the way they both liked it. And no questions was a good thing, because it's not like Frank couldn't be sneaky. Heidelberg 4-color offset presses don't just cost a ton, they weigh a ton, or several tons, with models ranging between 2,000 and 72,000 pounds. Even on the smaller end, it's hard to simply sneak something like that into a garage. They're also not quiet, running anywhere from 70 decibels, as loud as a vacuum cleaner, to 85 decibels, the noise level of a busy city street. Frank wanted to get the manufacturing over with as quickly as possible. The longer he had this incriminating raw material stored in the garage, the more he was exposed. As resourceful as he was, Frank knew he couldn't operate this machine by himself to the extent and speed his operation required. He needed an extra set of hands, and he found someone with the perfect resume, someone who had industry experience and a prison record. Frank and his press operator worked 16-hour days at odd hours of the night trying to essentially speed run the manufacturing process. If the farmer was paying any attention, he probably wouldn't have assumed they're printing wedding invitations or comic books. As you know, those guys don't seem super desperate to get everything done. It's also worth mentioning here that this is similar to back when Frank had his brake pad business. The same amount of work and hours that sent him into a breakdown. So perhaps here, because for one it's illegal and two it's making more money, that balances it out enough for him. It's not the hours that bothered him before, it's what he was doing those hours for. Anyway, it didn't take long before Frank had perfected the color, which he described as the exact moment he knew he was going to be filthy rich. Soon, this little garage startup was printing, pressing, and cutting tens of millions of dollars a month. By 2010, he had printed all 12.5 million bills. Next was the move from manufacturing to distribution, which Frank assumed would be the easy part. I mean, who wouldn't want to buy real money at a fraction of the price? But despite his previously successful criminal exploits, selling the money would prove to be much harder than he anticipated. Like his raw material suppliers, Frank knew that his buyers would need to be based outside of the US. Non-American retail, bank, and even casino employees are not nearly as exposed to American dollar bills. They're not thoroughly trained on what to look and feel for. More importantly, having his counterfeit product originate in Europe, Asia, or Africa meant it would exchange a lot of hands before making its way back to American banks and circulation. It was a gradual and anonymous way to disseminate the money, so there was a much lower chance of it being labeled as counterfeit, let alone being traced back to him. Frank hired an old colleague to take over his former position as middleman. He targeted international buyers who had experience moving and distributing money across borders. Naturally, he looked at drug traffickers who were already moving lots of drugs and money. And like a drug supplier, Frank even offered samples of his own product. But much to his surprise, no one was interested. Even with a nearly perfect American bill, moving cocaine was actually less risky than dabbling in counterfeit money. After spending all of his savings, Frank was now giving out free money, for all intents and purposes, and seeing nothing in return. So Frank brought another old friend to help him with buyers, and help he did. This friend was able to entice 4 buyers, but they were hesitant. They wanted to test their own market first. Initial orders were only for $10,000. Even if Frank sold $10,000 a day, every day, it would take him nearly 70 years to offload his entire supply of $250 million. As you can imagine, this was demoralizing. But all of Frank's diligence and extreme attention to detail would finally pay off once his money did its thing. The first orders were a success, and the buyers liked what they saw and how it moved through the market. This fake money was as good as the real thing. The buyers would gradually increase their orders up to $250,000, then $500,000, then a full $1 million a week. Frank recouped his investment and then some, but there was a problem. Even at this increased rate, it would still take him more than a year to sell his entire supply, and he wanted to be one and done with this phase so he could walk away from it forever. The problem was that instead of sitting on piles of incriminating raw materials, he was now sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars in fake cash. Being that exposed for a year was out of the question. So Frank would need more buyers. His search spanned the entire globe, but ultimately, he and his colleagues would find another buyer right in their backyard. The buyer who would unravel it all. So to understand what happened, a quick history lesson. The United States Secret Service was created in 1865 by Abraham Lincoln, not to protect the president from danger and assassination, but mainly to combat counterfeiting, which I actually talk about the startup of that in last week's video about the Pinkertons, so shameless plug inserted here. The agency has clearly evolved and expanded since then, but it still plays a large role in anti-counterfeiting operations. Along with the Federal Reserve, the Secret Service tracks serial number patterns as a main measure to identify counterfeit money. If a bill's number comes up as a duplicate or as some sort of statistical anomaly, it gets flagged. The bill will then be inspected and analyzed using high-resolution scanning, magnetic ink detection, and ultraviolet lights. If there are large amounts of flagged bills in the same area, This signals the presence of counterfeiting operations, which triggers a federal investigation. This is what happened to Frank. By 2012, Frank was still sitting on more than half a box truck full of counterfeit cash, and unfortunately for him, the Secret Service had found traces of his counterfeit $20 bills in both Florida and Las Vegas. This was also at about the same time that Frank had hired another middleman. This new guy was also from Trois-Rivières, named Eric Lefebvre. Lefebvre was in the business of trafficking stolen heavy machinery and vehicles, like dump trucks and front-end loaders. And for 2 years, Lefebvre was unknowingly selling this stolen machinery to an undercover cop. This became a major problem for Frank when Lefebvre asked this undercover cop if he wanted to buy some really good counterfeit money in addition to his usual haul of equipment. And the undercover cop said, "Of course I do. Counterfeit cash, where can I get it?" The cop ordered $100,000 of Frank's product, kicking off a sting operation known as Operation Cranium or Project Cranium, a joint effort between the United States Secret Service, Interpol, and the Canadian Royal Mounted Police. These agencies began surveilling Lefebvre, which led them to surveilling Frank. After the undercover cop placed a second order for another $100,000, the agents traced the money trail. Frank packed up the bills and drove them to Lefebvre himself, something he likely wouldn't have done earlier as a far more cautious criminal, but it seems wanting to get rid of these bills made him desperate. To be fair, Frank had no idea he was considered a person of extreme interest to multiple international agencies, and that a helicopter was following him at an altitude so high that it set out of earshot as they watched him deliver the package. So, in the early morning of May 23rd, 2012, Operation Cranium came to a head. These puns in this video are unacceptable. Frank was sleeping at his girlfriend's house when someone pounded on the door, yelling for Frank to wake up. It was the authorities. Frank opened the door to a dozen officers from the Canadian Mounted Police and U.S. Secret Service. Frank was kept handcuffed in the kitchen while they searched the house. There they found guns, several computers, an anti-counterfeit pin, printing plates, a foil press, and dye cut in the same font as the 20 on the $20 bill. They also found about $1 million in $20 bills that the Canadian authorities identified as very high quality counterfeit banknotes, basically undetectable to the naked eye. Which I'm no expert, but if you're trying to get a guy for counterfeiting and you find all that counterfeit money, I don't think you need all the other stuff. I think that's pretty open and shut. The highly coordinated Operation Cranium simultaneously raided 5 other locations across Quebec, adding to the mounting evidence. The Canadian police arrested Frank and seized all the cash, fake and real, that they could get their hands on. And here Frank's criminal days were officially over. Frank was charged with counterfeiting, possession of counterfeit money, trafficking in counterfeit currency, and possession of instruments of counterfeiting. Basically, all the charges that are related to counterfeiting. In addition to that, he was charged with several counts of possession of an unregistered firearm and possession of drugs including meth and marijuana, which I'm not sure if that was for business or medicinal use. Under Canadian jurisdiction, Frank was looking at up to 14 years in prison. Given his history, he likely wouldn't have been given the living room sentence he had previously been granted. He did think, however, that he would only serve about 1/6 of the max, so about 2.5 years. But the U.S. Secret Service wanted to extradite Frank and prosecute him in the American system, which is much harsher. If convicted in a U.S. courtroom, he could have been sentenced up to 60 years behind bars. Investigators scoured Frank's computers and records, attempting to find more unaccounted counterfeit money in addition to the $1 million they had already seized. They wanted him to do the max amount of time. Frank's lawyer negotiated a deal for bail 6 weeks after his arrest. He wasn't due to face trial until December of 2013, a year and a half later. Just shy of his court date, in the fall of 2013, Frank's lawyer worked even more magic. He had been carefully crafting a plea bargain for a year and had finally convinced Canadian prosecutors to offer Frank an unbelievably generous deal: 6-month jail sentence. That's right, he could go from 14 years in jail to 6 months. Frank rejected it. I had the thought earlier that this guy is definitely a Saul Goodman type, but it's getting reinforced with every paragraph. 6 months. A slap on the wrist compared to the potential 60 years he was facing if tried in an American court. Even more frustrating, Frank wouldn't even tell his lawyer his reasons for holding out. Whatever his move was, Frank was playing it very close to the chest. Then, just before his trial was set to begin, Frank played his hand. He told his lawyer that he still had $200 million worth of counterfeit money stashed away. Months prior, he had loaded the remaining $200 million and the second printing press in a box truck, then hid it in the plainest of sights, a parking lot of a hotel. It was secured with merely a padlock, and he wanted to use it as leverage. Frank had his defense craft a new deal. He would surrender one of his two presses and the $200 million of fake money in exchange for even more lenient terms. He wanted the prosecutors to stop trying to seize his girlfriend's house, return his Mitsubishi, and reduce his sentence to time served. So 6 weeks of jail time that he already did, some fake money, albeit a lot of fake money, to let him walk. This is an absurd request, right? I mean, 6 weeks of time served. With his rap sheet and the serious nature of the counterfeiting, gun, and drug charges, I mean, who did this guy think he is? Well, it seems he thought he was him. And he was right because the prosecutors agreed to the deal. On January 31st, 2014, Frank led a motorcade of authorities to the hotel parking lot where he opened the truck and showed them the scores of neatly packed, shoebox-sized boxes of counterfeit money. Money he printed in himself that he was now cashing in for his own freedom. Frank, the genius criminal businessman who could and maybe should have been in Forbes, said this was all part of the game plan. Quote, "Before I even started my plan for any of this, the very first concrete thing that I did work on and plan for was my escape." Gosh, he's so cool. I hate that he's so cool, but he's so cool. It's like Kaiser Soze walking out of the police station. Like, it was his game. We were just pawns in it. The investigators and prosecutors in this case maybe should have taken a lesson from Frank's diligence and attention to detail. They had him surrender the money, but never forced him to disclose the location of his operation, which still contains one of the Heidelberg presses and a lot of his other equipment. I mean, it seems like a pretty massive oversight. It's like he said, "I've got one press and $200 million, and they slapped a deal on the table without asking for, everything else. After about 4 years of work and his initial investment of $300,000, Frank earned about $15 million real dollars from the $50 million fake ones that he sold. And it seems the police only took what they were able to find. How much of that he was able to keep, he hasn't disclosed either, but he did say that he isn't necessarily, quote, living off that money, but I'm getting work from it. He's so cool. Frank vowed to never make an honest dollar again, and he didn't really hold up to that bargain. Just as Frank Abagnale ended up working with the FBI to identify forged and fraudulent checks, Frank opened up his final business, counterfeit prevention. Quote, "I've decided to completely reinvent my counterfeiting operation and turn it into a positive opportunity to help people. With an impressive resume featuring more hands-on experience than just about anyone else, Frank now advises businesses and government entities on how to protect themselves from people like him." So cool. It's like he became a counterfeiter, made a bunch of money, walked out of jail with his own money, and is still making money being a counterfeiter. Normally, this type of story is a cautionary tale, a parallel to Icarus, who flew too close to the sun. But considering how everything worked out, it seems like Frank's little bubble of suspended responsibility never popped. So for anyone who's listening right now, sitting at a red light, wondering, should I open a food truck? Don't do it. Far too much financial risk. However, counterfeiting US dollars in Canada seems like a safer bet that, once again, my legal team has made me advise I don't want you to do. And that is the story of the king of counterfeiting, who, despite his title, got away with it. I mean, yes, crime is bad. Don't do crime, right? We've all established that. But if you're going to do crime, and if it's a kind of crime that doesn't hurt any person physically, and you're going to make a lot of money really quick, it's a pretty cool way to do it. I don't know, there's a very Robin Hood quality to this of a guy working a 9-to-5 and being like, this is insane. Why don't I just print the money and then sell that? And then lo and behold, he did. There's also such a dedication to it, taking a couple years to learn all the ins and outs of the money-making process so that you can best repeat it. It's hard to not like the guy at least a little bit, is all I'm saying. Again, don't do that. When you go to post a YouTube video, it asks what kind of content will be in the video so advertisers know. And there's one box that I always thought was stupid because it asks you if your video encourages unsafe or illegal actions. And I'm like, who would ever check that? But now for this one, I think I'm going to have to check that. What I know I'm going to have to do is say that I appreciate you all being here and watching the video for this long. And we just want to say thank you for watching. Support on the channel has been fantastic. You guys are the best, and the fact that you're still watching what we put out means the world. We post here Mondays at noon. You can watch gaming videos over on Wendiglitch, and of course the OG channel Wendigoon will all be linked in the description. Everyone who made this video possible will be credited in the description, so be sure to show them some love. And all in all, I believe that should do it for now, but before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye! You know, the real problem he ran into is there wasn't anyone willing to sell him the paper and stuff like that. So what you really got to get into is counterfeiting the counterfeiters, right? So if you pose as a business that sells the security paper and then they call you to make counterfeit money and you're like, yes, of course I'll sell to you. You just give me $40,000 and you do that and you send them fake paper. And then when the police come to arrest you, you're like, oh, well, I just sell fake paper. Is that a crime, officer? And then they can't do anything about it. And then you can extort the police for money to give them your clients. That sounds like a great way to make money and definitely not be killed in the desert. I've got work to do.